This lecture is concerned with the development of a public sphere in the course of the 19th century, in which the print media came to play a very important role. In fact, in the evolution of the modern public sphere in India, we cannot actually avoid this discussion of the development of a newspaper culture. And obviously, it is related to the technology of printing and the print culture generally. But the newspaper culture additionally has a very significant place to the extent that it was through the newspapers that the debate in the public sphere was initially conducted before political associations or different political or quasi political groups emerged in Indian society to articulate similar ideas and sentiments. It is also worth noting that the print media acquires great significance as a major contributor to the development of nationalism. So, what we actually understand by the nationalist public sphere, a certain coming together of people from different regions, is enriched and nourished by the print media. And Benedict Anderson has written a book called The Imagined Communities, in which he argues for a very significant role of the print media, which allowed people living in distant places to develop a certain kind of empathy, certain kind of communication with one another. Nationalism emerged out of this process of social communication between different regions, in which the newspaper culture or the print media had a very significant contribution. So, saying this, it is important to recognize that the development of the print media in the course of the 19th century was not a very smooth sailing process. Certainly, by the close of the century, it became firmly linked with politics. Politicians of different persuasions, different groups, wished to articulate their views through newspapers, many of whom actually controlled newspapers, published newspapers, and most of them actually wished to acquire a certain space in the public domain through the registration of their presence in the newspaper. This is a very common inclination or common psychology that public figures would like their presence to be registered in the public media. But in addition, the connection that the print media eventually came to forge with the politics ultimately addresses the question of the freedom of the press.
What was the attitude of the colonial state to this liberal principle of freedom of the press?
This is the question that is very central to our understanding of how the print media in the course of the 19th century managed to develop despite the many obstacles which came its way, despite the many constraints within which the print media had to function. And we find that despite the liberal profession of the British officials, who in their own countries would certainly be talking about the need to create a free press, their attitudes towards the Indian press was not so liberal. There are moments when liberalism actually influenced policy making in this regard, but there were also enough evidence of how the British officials, in their anxiety to keep the business of government out of public scrutiny, out of public review, would try to constrain the press in many ways. That also might be the reason why the Indian press in the early days concentrated mainly on social issues. Since a discussion on the business of government, their comments on how the government was functioning were likely to incur the wrath of the officials, they perhaps wished to avoid these questions until their political connection or the kind of link that was established between the print media and politics made articulation of dissenting opinion somewhat inevitable. But by way of answering the question that you have raised, which is of central importance, is that if you look at the early part of the history, I mean, when, say, for example, James Hickey published his Bengal Gazette, it was set up in 1780 and it had to be wound up in 1782 because the entire place was seized by Warren Hastings, because Hickey was actually publishing very critical remarks about Warren Hastings' policies in the Bengal Gazette. So that was one of the early instances of how the early colonial rulers were not actually in a mood to tolerate any kind of public dissent. Wellesley also had the same attitude, and the regulations that Wellesley actually promulgated, press regulations, wished to keep the government completely out of public review. On the other hand, one of the persistent features of colonial policy was to support the loyalist English-owned newspapers. For example, James Hickey, of course, was an Englishman, but when Bengal Gazette was wound up, then Hastings encouraged the publication of Indian Gazette, and he knew that the Indian Gazette was going to follow a more loyalist line. The same attitude was shown by the British rulers later when the government actually purchased loyalist newspapers, the Anglo-Indian newspapers like the Statesman, the Englishman, the Pioneer in Allahabad. You have similar such newspapers being published from most of the major maritime cities, which were actually voicing the opinion of the colonial government. They came up with minor criticisms, but on them they could rely. And such newspapers always had the support of the well-entrenched business interest in the maritime cities. They had a more fund, they had the support of the government. Case of the Indian newspaper industry, of course, however, was different. One important point that is to be borne in mind in this context, before we come to the Indian industry, that in 1835, synchronizing with the new education policy that Macaulay had initiated, the government became somewhat tolerant about the question of the free press, preceded by a kind of movement that Rammohn Roy had initiated in favor of freedom of the press in 1823. In the same year when Rammohn Roy was actually sending his petition to Amherst for the introduction of English education, Rammohn Roy believed that the English rulers had a responsibility to introduce liberal principles in India, liberal education, freedom of the press. These were cardinal principles in the creation of a liberal society in England. So there was, in fact, a kind of movement from within the Indian intelligentsia for the creation of a relatively free environment with freedom of the press. And after a period of trying with constraints over this freedom, in 1835, some amount of relaxation was made in such controls. Pre-censorship was abolished and some amount of public scrutiny of government's business was also allowed. But this was never a consistent policy. In 1857 again, when the English rulers became sensitive about the way the Indian press was actually voicing critical opinion about British military strategy, repressive policies, they became once again anxious to reimpose control. So the evolution of the Indian press needs to be studied within this broader framework of occasional relaxation by the colonial state, allowing a semblance of freedom of the press, but every time there was also an anxiety to keep control over it, to prevent articulation of dissenting opinions. It came in 1857. It also came with Vernacular Press Act of Lytton in 1878. But by that time, the situation had changed.
Sir, how did such constraints imposed by the colonial state shape the history of the print media?
We can start with the argument that in the early part of the 19th century, when these constraints were more forcefully enforced, the emphasis in Indian press was on social issues, on educational issues. But over time, the situation would change. One way of answering this question is to look at the way the Indian press behaved in the early part of the 19th century. But I was actually telling you that constraints were also suitably blended with incentives. Because while there was an attempt all the while to impose control over the Indian press in order to prevent it from voicing dissenting opinion, there was always this attempt by the English rulers to prop up English-owned newspapers who would be taking the imperial position and behave very differently from the way the Indian press would behave. This is one way of looking at it. But one might always say that every time this strategy didn't work, some of these newspapers would otherwise remain very loyal, or if not loyal, would be more tolerant about British rule, but there would be occasions when they would come up with very significant criticism of British policy. Take, for example, the case of Harish Mukherjee's Hindu Patriot. The Hindu Patriot, by and large, followed a moderate political line. They were not critical of imperialism as such, but during the Indigo Rebellion or during the revolt of 1857, in many of its reports, the tone of the Hindu Patriot was very critical. Harish Chandra Mukherjee, the famous editor of the Hindu Patriot, was reporting quite consistently about the many misdeeds of the indigo planters, their brutalities in the countryside. And in this manner, he was actually firing his salvos against the well-entrenched interest of the British business houses, including the plantation interest. And even though Harish Mukherjee was not a great admirer of the rebellious Sepoys in 1857, but Harish Mukherjee was also very critical of the way the British behaved somewhat inhumanly towards the Sepoy rebels. Harish Mukherjee expected the British to behave in a more liberal, human fashion. So it is more nuanced. I mean, a newspaper which otherwise would actually not be so intolerant about imperialism would still be critical of imperialism. And the tone of this criticism, the virulence of this criticism would actually become much more sharper towards the close of the 19th century, when I have said a clear connection was forged between newspapers and political activity. And it is common knowledge that along with newspapers, the political associations would constitute the modern public sphere.
Sir, how do you visualize these changes that were taking place in this period?
I was actually telling you a little while ago that in the early days, the newspapers concentrated mainly on social and educational issues. They were articulating demands for social reform, educational reform. The Indian newspaper industry began to grow from around 1816, but there was a major incentive for further development in the 1830s, thanks to the relaxation that the government had made in the press laws. And secondly, this was also the time when the Indian intelligentsia was responding more creatively to these reformist initiatives of the government. That was the time when you see a major public debate unfolding in the public sphere about reformism itself, about social change, about the extent to which Western education was suitable for India. So one has to recognize the fact that the press was not necessarily articulating a liberal or reformist position. The press has its many segments. Some were more liberal-minded, others were more conservative. So if you look at the Bengal public sphere in the 1830s, the moment when the press in Calcutta was slowly emerging as a fairly strong entity in the public sphere, there were clear divisions in opinion. Different newspapers were actually tied with different kinds of opinions. Some were conservative, as I said. Samachar Chandrika, for example, was an extremely conservative newspaper or journal, which went to the extent of supporting Sati, while Ram Mohan would be taking an entirely different line. Or, for example, the Derosian journal called Gyanannation, which began to be published from 1831 onwards. It was a weekly paper. It actually took up the cause of reform more forcefully than even the Brahmo newspapers. So you have Brahmo papers which would actually voice the position that Ram Mohan had taken on reform. It is also very instructive that Samachar Chandrika had a greater amount of circulation than either Gyanannation or the other Brahmo newspapers. Gyanannation, for example, was circulated at times freely in order to attract people to this reformist viewpoint, but I don't think that it had a very lasting impact. Tattvabodhini Patrika, for example, which began to be published somewhat later, was once again a reformist paper which was interested in promoting the cause of educational reform. You have different kinds of opinion which began to be expressed through different kinds of newspapers. And political journalism was one important new phenomenon which made its appearance sometime around 1840s. The best example, of course, is Hindu Patriot, which was linked with the British Indian Association, a moderate political body. But Hindu Patriot was also, as I said, critical of some of the British practices. Take, for example, the case of Delhi Urdu Akhbar in Delhi, which was very critical of the British and which sided with the rebels during the revolt of 1857, set up by a set of Delhi intellectuals who were students of Delhi College, and eventually they had connections in the Mughal court at Delhi. And Delhi Urdu Akhbar became the vehicle of expression of hostile opinion against the Raj. You can take examples from Bombay, for example. Rast Guftar, the famous journal that was set up by Dadabhai Nauroji, one of the earliest nationalist, one may say proto-nationalist newspapers, a weekly. This Rast Guftar was set up in 1851. And one of the objectives of the Rast Guftar was to preach reformism. They wanted the Parsi community, which is a very conservative and orthodox community, to undergo social reform. And against Rast Guftar were several conservative Parsi journals. To cite one example, you have Jam-e-Jamshed. So that was the conservative front of the Parsi community in Bombay. It was through Rast Guftar that Dadabhai Nauroji began to circulate his ideas about economic nationalism, about the drain of wealth, about deindustrialization. And it is said that Nauroji had to spend a huge lot of money from his own purse, from his own personal resources, in order to attract people to this journal. He distributed this Rast Guftar freely among the possible clients. So the point is that you have such people who were concentrating on social reform issues, educational issues, and were publishing these early newspapers. But I was telling you, and the example of Hindu Patriot therefore becomes relevant to underline the point, that sometime around the 1860s and 1870s, there was a growing interest among Indian newspapers about political issues. There was a shift towards political journalism, so to say.
Sir, what were these issues which actually excited them?
Yeah, there are a number of issues of political importance. It's not merely the question of social reform anymore which would excite them. Political questions began to energize the managers of the Indian press, the publishers and the printers. Take, for example, the issue of cotton tariff duties. The way the government of India was actually depriving Indian industry of protection and therefore creating insurmountable barriers against the development of textile industry began to be reported in the Indian press quite extensively. It was reported in some of the major weekly newspapers, and then the idea was percolating downwards to the local newspapers. So even if those localities which did not have any immediate concern with textile industry, would be reporting about the cotton duties. Take, for example, the deposition of Sayajirao Gaikwad in the early 1870s. Bengal newspapers had nothing to do with the deposition of the ruler of a faraway princely state of Baroda, but that was reported in these newspapers quite extensively as another example of British injustice to the Indian prince. Municipal taxation, for example, would emerge as another issue. Revenue rates, high revenue rates on the peasantry, which were actually impoverishing them, would be counted as one of the major questions that the Indian press was addressing. So, such were these political questions that began to excite them from 1860s, 1870s onwards. This transformation has been traced by Uma Dasgupta in a very interesting book called Rise of the Indian Public, in which Uma Dasgupta actually talks about the way that these public issues of political importance were a clear pointer to the development of political journalism on the one hand, and that the sentiments that began to be expressed in the Indian press cut across local and regional barriers. Ideas began to percolate downwards to the level of the local press. Ideas began to travel from one region to another to create a situation which Benedict Anderson actually visualizes in the emergence of nationalism. It doesn't mean, however, that the preoccupation with social reform entirely went away. That preoccupation persisted, and newspapers attached to rival ideological positions on questions of social reform began to debate quite forcefully some of the social reform issues. And one such issue in the late 19th century, which excited the newspaper world, was the age of consent movement. In the early part of the 1890s, when the government decided to intervene in the marriage customs by raising the marriageable age of women. And that was the moment when you see a kind of a public battle was taking place among rival newspapers. In Bengal, for example, you have the Brahmo newspapers like Sanjivani or Bengali of Surendranath Banerjee, Brahmo inclined, reform-minded newspapers who would be supporting this. On the other side, you have the more conservative newspapers like Bongobashi, edited by Shashodhar Tarko Churamani, very stoutly defending the Hindu custom and defending the right of the Hindus to pursue their customs without being hampered in any way by these kinds of interventions. And this is not a phenomenon restricted to Bengal alone. You see similar things happening in Maharashtra as well, when Ganesh Agarkar, a liberal-minded intellectual of the Deccan Education Society, a friend of Gokhale, a follower of Ranade, a follower of Chiplonkar, another very important liberal-minded intellectual of Pune, Ganesh Agarkar and Tilak were together publishing Maratha and the Kesri. Kesri was and in the Deccan Education Society on this issue, a very important division took place, a political division. Agarkar was thrown out. Agarkar started publishing a newspaper called Sudharak. So that is clearly the link with the reform question or the reform mentality of Agarkar was manifest in the way he named this reform-minded journal. On the other hand, you have Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who was actually moving very strongly into political journalism, using Maratha and Kesri for propagation of militant nationalist ideas. Tilak is the great example of how he was making use of these newspapers in order to establish his dominance in the politics of Western India. You have on the other side the Amrita Bazar Patrika group, which was hostile to Suren Banerjee's reformism. And around Amrita Bazar Patrika group evolved a different kind of political formation, which was critical of liberal moderate strategy. So between Hindu Patriot and Amrita Bazar Patrika, there was an intense competition. That the competition was not merely to recruit clientele, readership, but it was a political conflict between the moderate liberal nationalism of the Hindu Patriot, now edited by Krishnadas Pal, and you have the more aggressive kind of nationalism represented by Amrita Bazar Patrika. You have the same situation in Madras, for example. You have the Hindu group, Hindu by which time became an important nationalist daily in southern India, and the early Liberal Congress leadership clustered around this newspaper. So, the newspaper industry in India retained the early 19th century legacy of conflict between reformism and conservatism, and this was transmuted into a kind of political alignment, rival political alignments that began to be seen in the way rival newspapers started representing different points of view. This is the way you can actually see the evolution of the print media. But you have an inside view of the print media as well, which is how the newspaper industry was organized, how the Indian newspaper industry, devoid of the kind of support that the English newspapers, the English-owned newspapers received from the state, depended almost entirely on resources mobilized by family members or friends. You have many such stories in literature of how people were actually becoming very interested in the publication of newspapers, mobilizing resources from their own family fund, and thereby losing out a huge lot of money in the process of promoting newspapers. And if you look at the structure of the newspaper industry, you have those important newspapers in the maritime cities in which figures like Ranade were involved in Bombay, or Mandlik in Bombay. They had their own newspapers. Mandlik has Native Opinion. That is the backbone of vernacular newspaper. Amritabajar Patrika started in Jessore, but that time it was a vernacular newspaper. Then once in Calcutta, it became a bilingual newspaper, but later on it became an English language newspaper, basically a nationalist English language newspaper. If you look at the vernacular newspaper industry, you have some of the more prominent ones like Amritabajar Patrika or Indu Prakash, edited by Ranade in Bombay, or Mandlik's Native Opinion. But below that level, you have a whole range of small town newspapers. That actually was the backbone of the vernacular press. Circulation was limited, resources were limited, published by an inadequate printing press, clumsily published. The quality of publication was bad, but nonetheless, they became an important constituent of newspaper industry, relaying information from the urban level to the local level. So this is the reason why the Vernacular Press Act had to be promulgated in 1878, when criticism of the government was percolating downwards to the rural level through these local newspapers. So that is the way the print media evolved. Despite many limitations, despite the lack of resources, the print media, for such reasons, acquires so much of significance as a very important factor in the development of a nationalist public sphere. And the connection between the nationalist public sphere and the print culture by now should be very clear to you.